next presenter is Zac Ruzycki. Zac is the Director of Resource Planning at Great River Energy. His department focuses on long-term strategy and planning, including quantitative analytical work like energy and demand forecasting and econometric modeling, in addition to regulatory affairs, renewable energy acquisitions, and contract management. Prior to his work at Great River Energy, Zac worked for the Minnesota Department of Commerce, the Indiana Department of Environmental Management. He received master's degrees from the Indiana University O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs, that's a mouthful, and focusing on energy economics and policy. Zac.
Thanks, Jeff. Good morning. So this morning I want to set the stage and talk a little bit about our industry, the grid, the system that we're talking about. You've heard a lot this morning from Jim Matheson, from Derek and others about what's happening in our industry. What I would like to do is just set the stage and develop a better understanding of local regional industry issues, really touching on reliability. Great River Energy is a generation transmission cooperative that provides wholesale power and transmission to Lake Region, and issues that affect the carbon-free standard and how we are going to comply with that. So the first question is, what is the carbon-free standard? Well, the carbon-free standard is something the legislature passed in 2023 that obligates utilities, including GRE, to procure a certain level of carbon-free assets to serve their load. For cooperatives, it's 60% in 2030, 90% in 2035, and 100% in 2040. And that may seem like a pretty steep challenge, but I'll unpackage a little bit why that's something that we're tracking for compliance today and how that affects reliability and makes us think a different way about how we plan our portfolio. My buttons aren't working well, Dylan. Oh, there we go. It's just really delayed. Apologies. I'm trying to go back. There we go. Okay. So to begin, I wanted to talk a little bit about reliability. You've heard a little this morning already from Jim and others. NERC seasonal assessment. So what is NERC? NERC is the North American Electric Reliability Corporation. They're the entity that's responsible for developing standards and metrics that ensure reliability across the United States. In summer of 2024, winter 24-25, we do see an elevated risk of insufficient operating reserves. And what that means is it's orange. Right? We're not on red alert, but there is a risk that if we see continued load growth and retirements of assets, there could be some stresses on the system that might result in above normal operating concerns when you have periods of high load. So cold days in winter, hot days in summer. There are a lot of organizations that do this type of reliability assessment. NERC is just one of them. GRE looks at this, and so does the energy market. So I'll talk a lot this morning about MISO, the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator. That is the energy market in which we live and do business. It spans what you'll see on the next slide is this red portion. That is MISO. And this is the 5-year assessment from NERC. The previous was this year. So you might look at this and say, red, well, that's not good. You're right. But what this looks at is not just how risky we are as a region. This looks at what are our drivers of risk? What is our level of exposure to reliability events when we have above normal operating conditions? So for us in MISO, we're looking at increasing load. We've heard about data centers, you're hearing electrification, electric vehicles, heat pumps, all these other things that we're electrifying everything. We also think about retirement of coal generation, a new generation coming online. I'll speak in a little bit about the new generation coming online, which is mostly wind and solar and storage, and that's very different than what we have in the system today, which is coal and gas and nuclear, which is dispatchable. It's also important to know that the red portion here is MISO, but MISO is broken into separate areas. And our portion of MISO, which we call Zone 1, which comprises Minnesota, North Dakota, some parts of South Dakota and Iowa, that showed an actual increase in available capacity from 2023 to 2024. And that was driven mostly by the way that MISO valued the resources that was in that region. So this is red, and there is a reason for a level of consciousness to understand how what we do and other utilities do impacts reliability on the system. Maybe I just have to press the button harder. So MISO capacity today. Capacity and energy are two very different things, and things that I'll try to set the table to explain. Capacity is the nameplate or potential operating conditions of a plant. So, you may drive by the Boswell unit in northern Minnesota, you may drive by some natural gas peaking generation resources. Those are a capacity of, let's say, 500 megawatts. That means that unit can operate up to that level, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that unit produces energy. So we have a substantial amount of capacity in MISO today. You can look at summer of 2025 and winter of 25 and 26. MISO currently has a very resilient resource mix that includes coal, gas, and renewables. The number to look at the very bottom, the PRMR, and that acronym stands for Planning Reserve Margin Requirement, that's how many resources, how much capacity does MISO need to maintain resource adequacy. So in the summer, it's 137,000 megawatts. And in the winter, it's 130,000 megawatts. Of that capacity in summer, 23.9% is coal, 41% is gas. We have some nuclear, 8.2%. A lot of that's coming in Illinois as well as in Minnesota with the two large Xcel Energy units at Prairie Island and Monticello. And in the winter, we see coal, gas, again, providing a majority of that. So the 130,000 plus megawatts that are required in MISO in the summer and winter, that's a really strong number that we see. And these are resources that are present on the system today. This isn't what the system needs. This is what's available in 25 and 26. MISO, just for your reference, last year predicted a summer peak of 123,000 megawatts. So there are more than sufficient planning reserve margins or operating reserves in MISO to satisfy reliability today. But this is today, and this is what's coming tomorrow. And there is a big difference. So what you saw previously was coal and gas and nuclear provided a substantial amount, almost 75% of the capacity. And what's in the queue today, and the queue is, what it sounds like, a line in which new resources coming onto the system has to enter a process to get online. What we see in the queue today is very different than what we see on the system today. If you look at the requests in MISO West, which is where we are, we have 273 projects in the queue, looking at the figure on the right. Of those 273 requests, there's 50,000 megawatts. And that's a lot. But most of that, 13,000 megawatts is solar, 18,000 megawatts is wind, and 11,000 megawatts is storage. So 36%, 22%, 28%. That is a huge majority where we're looking at more than 85% coming from non-dispatchable assets. And so it's a real interesting dynamic between what we have on the system today in MISO and what we have coming in the future. Now, you might look at that and think to yourself, well, there's a difference, right? There's a huge difference between what we have in the ground and what's coming tomorrow. And you're right, because this data indicates that there is a substantial evolution underway in MISO, and this is something that we've seen happening for the last 20 years. So this isn't new. The challenge is amplified, it's magnified a little bit because we have a substantially much larger amount of load that we have coming on the system, and there are a lot of concerns about reliability right now. But this transition from one thing to another is not something new. 2005, MISO had 65% of its energy coming from coal. By 2022, that 65% had shrunk to 30% coming from coal, but we saw a large expansion in natural gas to 36%. And keep in mind, this is energy, this isn't capacity, this is what's actually producing on the system. This is what's providing electrons to the transmission system that's powering your homes, your businesses when you turn the light switch on. What we see coming in 2042 represents something entirely different. And these are futures that MISO is studying. We have future 1A, 2A, 3A. All of these things are a little bit different in their constituency between resources, but they all indicate the same thing, that wind and solar in all futures are predicted to serve a majority of the load. Storage utilization is increasing, but future electrification levels and data center demand, things of that nature, that's unknown. But what I'm trying to show here is that there is a big difference in what's there, what's coming, and what's happening in MISO, what's happened in MISO for the last 20 years. This image indicates what we call planning reserve margins. And it's a little bit of a complex topic, but I'll try to boil it down here. The planning reserve margin is simply an insurance buffer. This is what MISO requires entities like Great River Energy, Minnesota Power, Xcel Energy, what we call market participants in MISO, to bring to the table. So when we bring resources to the table, we don't just bring resources that we need to meet our load. We have to bring resources that meet our load plus a little bit extra. MISO looks at season by season, and MISO determines what is the level of extra resources or reserve margins that entities must bring on a seasonal basis. Summer is 10%, so not that much more. You look at spring and winter, they're almost 25% in the winter and more than 25% in the spring. That tells us that those are periods of uncertainty. Those are periods where entities need to be bringing additional assets to the system. And these extra resources help to manage risk of extreme load or extreme outage events. We do have a number of things that are happening in MISO that are considering how utilities are planning and what resources we have to bring to the system. So if there's one thing to take away from this slide, it's that utilities aren't just planning to meet our load. We're planning to meet our load plus extra, and that extra helps us to ensure against reliability issues. We've heard from every presenter here today about the concerns on reliability and the concerns of outage events. This is one of the ways that we guard against that. When we bring resources to the system, we bring resources plus. And there are a number of other things that MISO is doing to help incentivize the correct behavior of electric utilities in the market. The planning reserve margin requirements is one thing. Another was a move to a seasonal construct. So before, we only evaluated reliability in the summer. We would look at what is our summer peak demand and what are our resources that we're providing to the system in the summer. And winter, spring, and fall would kind of tail those because at the time, the main reliability concern was only in the summer. Now, we know up here that the winter can be a little bit more challenging than the summer. We can have 3-4 days where it's negative 30, negative 40 degrees. And in the summer, we may have an afternoon or a couple of days where it's really hot. MISO and folks that work with MISO, like GRE, began to advocate for a more focused market construct where we evaluate reliability not just in the summer, but in the summer, the spring, the winter, and the fall. And so that impacts how we bring resources to the system. There are a few things that MISO is doing. I spoke about one, which is a seasonal construct. Another is a new type of market construct whereby they've changed the rules a little bit on how they do the math that underlies what the utilities bring to the table. It's called the reliability-based demand curve. It's a very technical concept, but what it results in is higher prices in the market for capacity. And you may think, well, higher prices, well, that's not good because we pay more. That's not necessarily the case. This is higher prices in the market itself. And what do higher prices indicate? Higher prices indicate more importance. And for years, MISO has been sending capacity pricing signals to the market that we didn't really think reflected the true value of those assets. So for years and years, capacity has been undervalued in MISO. So there hasn't really been an incentive for entities to bring new capacity to the table. This is changing a little bit now. We do see this construct increasing the cost of capacity and increasing these planning reserve margins. And that just sends a signal to the market that capacity is actually valuable. And that's a good thing because that means we're going to see more capacity come in. Utilities will get compensated for that capacity at a higher level in the markets, which results in folks like us and others wanting to build more. And that's objectively a good thing because we need more capacity. We've talked about this a number of times today. Another is accreditation. Accreditation simply means in MISO, how much value do you get for your resource? We have a lot of different types of assets. You've seen the figures that show gas, coal, wind, solar, storage. These are not homogeneous. They don't all get the same type of credit. You can build a 500 megawatt natural gas plant, and you're given credit in MISO for probably 80 to 90% of that. So you're getting about 450 megawatts of accredited capacity that goes towards our planning reserve margin requirements that I mentioned earlier. If you build a 500 megawatt solar plant, the accreditation you were given by MISO reflects its availability, not the nameplate capacity. So why does gas get such a strong accreditation percentage? It's because you can press that big red button and turn that plant on when you need it. You can't do that with solar and wind. And that doesn't mean it's a lesser resource, it just means it's a different resource. Because it's not dispatchable, it doesn't get the same credit that a dispatchable asset in the market would get. So if you build a 500 megawatt solar project, you might only get 50 megawatts of accredited capacity because that resource is not available during the times of the highest system needs. And that's one of the reasons why the calculus of replacing one thing with another isn't as simple as a one-for-one. You'll hear in the news when you hear talks about retirements of coal plants. Right now, we've got a number of coal plants in Minnesota that are slated for retirement. You've got Sherco and Becker, Boswell up north, it's a Minnesota Power unit. You've got King unit over by Hudson, Wisconsin. All of these units are substantial and large coal assets. And if you have a 1,000 megawatt coal asset, you can't just retire that and replace it with 1,000 megawatts of solar. You would need to replace it with 5,000 megawatts of solar, with another 2,000 megawatts of wind. So it is not a one-for-one. And this was a very positive change in MISO to more accurately reflect the availability of these assets and how they behave in the market, because what that means is it incentivizes more generation technology. You think about that queue. We had a ton of wind, a ton of solar, a ton of storage. That is providing a direct replacement for a lot of the retiring fossil fuel resources, the dispatchable assets. If MISO hadn't had made these changes to properly reflect their availability, you would be replacing dispatchable resources with non-dispatchable resources on a one-for-one basis. And that would cause a substantial amount of reliability concerns. By changing the rules a little bit and more accurately reflecting this, we're creating more demand and more need for these non-dispatchable assets. So that's my spiel about MISO. I'll talk a little bit about GRE now, kind of set the stage on reliability, about the markets, about how we do business, how we think about what we build and why. And now I'd like to speak a little bit about GRE, what our portfolio construction is, why we build it the way we do, and how that factors into this carbon-free standard, and how does that work with these larger MISO issues that I spoke a little bit about. So just like MISO, GRE prioritizes a robust and diverse resource mix. We have a mixture of dispatchable and renewable energy, and this is something that we've been intentionally building for the last 20 years. You can look at this map and see how geographically diverse our portfolio is, and that's a good thing, because when you see these green dots, which are our wind units, they're spread all over this part of the country. We have wind far west in North Dakota. We have wind in Iowa, in South Dakota, southern Minnesota. These resources and the way that we spread them out means that they are not subject to the same type of wind availability. If you have a period of time in which there's no wind in North Dakota, but there's some in southern Minnesota, that's great. If all your wind in North Dakota was that's where you had it all, you'd have a big problem, because you wouldn't have a ton of energy being generated from those assets. And why that's important to us is that we sell all of our generation from our portfolio into MISO. We don't directly serve load with our resources. And that's another fairly large misconception in the market, is that our assets don't directly serve our member load via directly interconnected transmission. That's one of the benefits of being in the MISO market. We buy all of our load needs out of the market on a daily basis. We sell all of our generation to the market. What that generation does is it hedges our members' exposure to those market prices. You probably remember what happened in ERCOT a couple of years ago in Texas with Winter Storm Uri. We had a huge amount of cold weather, ice come through. It was very unusual. It froze up gas resources. It stopped wind generation. And what happened? The price of energy in the market to purchase went through the roof. Right? It increased to incredibly high levels. It caused bankruptcies. It caused substantial financial harm to ratepayers and utilities. That's because they were subject to buying energy out of the market at those high prices and couldn't sell anything into the market to get revenues and hedge themselves against those purchases. That's what we're trying to do with our assets. We produce most of our energy with wind, and we will for the next 10 to 20 years. We have a substantial amount of gas capacity too. All these dots that are blue and purple, They represent gas resources that are dispatchable. And these don't run a lot. They only run 2, 3, 4% of the hours of the year. But they run when the market needs them the most. They run on the coldest days of winter, the hottest days of the summer. And why they have two colors is that we can run those units on gas and oil. And that's really important for us. That fuel diversity is incredibly valuable. Because if we have a situation in which gas is either prohibitively expensive or simply unavailable, but the market still needs the reliability characteristics that these units provide, we can switch them over to fuel oil and run on fuel oil for as long as we need to. And we've done that for 12, 24 hours in the past. So when the market sends us a price signal that we need this energy, right, we're going into a really hot couple of days in the summer, our gas units will run. And if they can't run on gas, then they'll run on oil, but they will run. And that hedges our members' exposure to prices in the market, and it provides reliability characteristics to the system. Our energy plan right now in 2023 reflects a pretty balanced portfolio. We're producing 26% of our energy from renewables. We're getting about 30% of our energy from market purchases, as those are financially appetizing for our portfolio and for our members. And we're receiving about 38% on a contract with the entity to whom we sold Coal Creek Station, our big coal unit. We sold that in 2020. That contract terminates in 2031, so we're in the middle right now of recalibrating our portfolio to ensure that we have enough energy assets to adequately hedge our member purchases. By 2037, our energy resources will be 72% from renewable energy. We'll have 16% from the market, about 5% from natural gas, and 7% from hydroelectric. That energy plan is backed up and reinforced by our capacity position. Our capacity position is very different than our energy position. I'll go back here. 72% from wind in 2037, 26% from wind today. When you look at our capacity, the figure on the right is accredited capacity. So what do we get value for in MISO? And the figure on the left is the nameplate capacity. So what are the actual numbers associated with each type of resource? In 2025, GRE had 47% of its nameplate capacity coming from gas. We accredit almost all of that because it is a dispatchable asset that has a very strong performance record in MISO. So our accredited capacity position is strongly backed by natural gas. And that's a good thing for us, it's a good thing for our members, it's a good thing for MISO. The way that we're building our portfolio is intentional, where we produce a lot of our energy from wind, and that wind we've procured over the last 10 years at extremely advantageous pricing for our members. The price of wind in the market has gone up 3 times since 2020. And you heard a little bit from Jim Matheson this morning about what's happening in D.C. with this budget reconciliation and the bill that came out of the House and what's in the Senate right now. The tax credits that are associated with wind and solar remain very valuable. And so if those are lost, or if they're sunset or terminated, the cost of wind energy in the market could increase another 30 to 50%. So the position that GRE has put our members in by intentionally procuring wind ahead of schedule for the last 10 years has resulted in a situation where we have a very balanced portfolio, where we produce our energy with wind, and we back that energy with the capacity and the dispatchability of natural gas. And that's a great portfolio construct, and we're really happy with that. We're very well positioned for our capacity position in MISO over the next 3 to 5 years. These are our positions: summer, fall, winter, spring. The blue bar indicates what is the capacity that we are bringing to the system. What do we provide MISO for reliability resources in the system? In every single season, we are providing more than MISO needs. The black and hashed bar there next to us is a combination of what is our load plus our planning reserve margin requirement, so that extra little bit of insurance that I talked about at the beginning. We're above and beyond that in every single season. So for our members, for Minnesota, for MISO, for the grid, we're providing the correct resources and the adequate resources that are needed to guarantee reliability. Now, we will need new capacity in the 2030s, and that's something that we're actively working on right now. We have some PPAs and power purchase agreements that are expiring, and we are looking at load growth. This is something that everybody in the industry is facing. We have a substantial amount of interest in Minnesota right now from the data center industry, from technology companies looking to site large new loads here, and that will provide uplift to our obligations to provide new capacity to the MISO market if those fully come to pass. And so we do need new capacity coming up in the future. So how are we thinking about doing that? You've already heard me say that wind and solar and storage don't provide a huge amount of capacity benefits, and that is the case. Storage is a little bit better than wind and solar. We expect about 50 to 70% accreditation for storage. So we build a 500 megawatt storage plant, we expect that we could get between 300 and 400 megawatts of accredited capacity. Now, we're not planning to build a 500 megawatt storage resource, but storage is a little bit of a stronger resource. So in the future, we want to continue to leverage our existing gas assets and add product and add projects that increases the accredited capacity. We're doing this at a number of our units. GRE's Elk River Station, our Cambridge #2 unit, and our Pleasant Valley Station. We want to add some projects to those that increase the amount of accredited capacity that we get out of them. That could add another 75 megawatts in the summer, 185 megawatts in the winter. We want to look at new resources under contract right now. We have an exciting number of wind contracts that we're bringing on to our members that are a part of the New Era portfolio. They're not dependent on New Era, but it's nicer to get $800 million than to not get $800 million. So these are resources that we want to see built, and we're going to bring them to the system, right? Red Butte Wind is our largest. It's a wind project in North Dakota. We expect that to get us another 40 to 60 megawatts of accredited capacity year-round. And then we're also looking at new dispatchable resources, new battery assets, and then new dual fuel peaking plant, new natural gas investments. So we need to make the correct investments given the backdrop of how MISO values assets and what the system needs and what our members require of us. So now I'd like to transition just a little bit to something totally different, but just as exciting, I hope. I spoke about MISO, I spoke about GRE. This is about nuclear. We've heard Derek talk about nuclear. We heard Jim talk about nuclear. I want to provide about 10 minutes talking about new nuclear in the US and discussing why it's important, the different types of resources, a couple of different companies that we're working with that are providing some really interesting new technologies. So the US operates the largest nuclear power fleet in the world. We have 93 traditional reactors across 28 states that account for 100,000 megawatts of capacity. And this is capacity that is strongly accredited in MISO because, again, it's firm baseload power. And what does firm baseload mean? That means it's available almost all the time. And that's the beauty of nuclear, is that it is not something that sits on the sidelines and waits until the system needs it. It is always producing. When you start a reactor, and that reactor is going at a 100% capacity factor all the time. So it's providing clean, firm baseload power to the system, and those characteristics are exactly what MISO wants today. And that's exactly what Minnesota wants today, right? Carbon-free standard, clean, firm baseload power. There are a number of new units coming on. I think Jim mentioned the Georgia Power and Oglethorpe, which is the cooperative that's working with Georgia Power, owning about 40% of that unit, added the Vogtle units 3 and 4 in just the last few years. Now, there were a substantial amount of cost overruns. You heard this morning, that resulted in a net cost of about $30 billion. Now, that's much higher than we thought it was going to be. We thought it was going to be about $14 billion. So the $36.8 billion results in a capital cost of that of about $16,500 a kilowatt. How does that compare to things today? A new natural gas combustion turbine that we have, so our 1,400 megawatts of gas units that we have in our system, they cost about $1,600 a kW. So 10x the cost for this Vogtle unit. But the thing is, the Vogtle unit is a large, typical and traditional reactor technology. And that's not what we're talking about today. What we're talking about is small modular reactor units. Very different than what you see at the XL units in Monticello and down at Prairie Island. These are very big Westinghouse AP1000 units that have enormously high capital costs but very low operating costs. They're challenging to build today, both from a permitting perspective and a cost perspective. And that's what makes small modular reactors, or SMRs, really exciting. SMRs use the same type of technology. They use fission technology. However, they're much smaller. They come in at less than 300 megawatts. These are factory-built assembled modules, and they're about 10% the size to 25% the size of a traditional nuclear unit. As of last year, there are a lot of designs worldwide, up to 100, with 25 of those based in the US. Small modular reactors are very exciting for a number of reasons. They have cost advantages, and it's probably really hard to read this slide, but I think that these will be made available to you, but I'll try to speak to the figures. The average cost of a small modular reactor we expect to be much lower. They require a far lower capital investment due to their compact size, and they can also match the productivity of these larger units. The time that it takes to build an SMR is also much shorter. These larger units, the traditional nuclear plants, every single reactor itself, not just the plant, but the reactor has to be commissioned and approved by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in the US. So the timelines for a large nuclear plant are 6 to 12 years, from the minute you decide to build it to the minute it starts producing electrons. SMR is much shorter, about 3 to 5 years. So cheaper and faster to market. Also, from a size perspective, there's a huge advantage. When we talk about siting, we talked about permitting. That's a huge thing in Minnesota. We all know that land availability, land costs are very valuable. The amount of land that an SMR takes is a fraction of what we see these large nuclear units taking up. So a 470 megawatt capacity SMR takes about 10 acres of land. A 1,000 megawatt traditional nuclear unit takes almost 850 acres of land. So for about half the capacity on the SMR, but 15% of the land use, right? And that's really compelling. It's compelling for a number of reasons. Less permitting concerns, less constraints on getting this thing built, on using land, but it's also able to site closer to load. You're not going to see a big 1,000 megawatt giant nuclear unit go next to a data center, right? It's physically impractical. An SMR, it's entirely possible that we could see a world in the next 15 to 20 years where we're siting these units on site at commercial and manufacturing and data center loads. Safety is also a huge concern, and I'll speak more to that in a minute, but they're very simple designs. SMRs use passive cooling systems, they require lower power, and they have much lower refueling requirements, and they also minimize the transportation and handling of nuclear fuel. So there's a lot that's going for SMRs, but they're a very new technology. They're one that's still under development by a number of different companies with whom GRE works. And I wanted to touch on the 3 of the most exciting companies that we're working with today, and then I'll wrap up. So NuScale is, if you've heard of an SMR in the news, it's probably been NuScale, because they've been around the longest, and they're the only small modular reactor design that's currently certified by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. It's a light water reactor. It has a 77 megawatt capacity per module, and it's scalable. So you can put 12 different modules on site. These are resources that we're really excited about, and we have a great relationship with NuScale. We've been working with them for years. They did have a demonstration plant in Idaho, and you heard Jim Matheson talk about, he's from Utah. Idaho, we did have a project that was being administered by the Utah Area Municipal Power Service, and that was going to be a pilot for this technology. In the last 3 or 4 years, we've seen a substantial amount of inflation on steel and other components that are necessary for construction. That took the cost of this asset above the price point that that entity was willing to pay for it. And so this project was paused. And we expect that to resume. In fact, we have a number of people who are involved in this from GRE that are tracking what NuScale is doing. But NuScale is one of the technologies. It's a much more traditional technology. It's very much like what you see in these big nuclear plants, just scaled down a little bit. TerraPower is another company we work with. They're totally different. And the next 2 companies, including TerraPower, I'm going to talk about very different designs, very different engineering perspective. This uses sodium in the nuclear reactor that allows that unit to store energy. So it's a sodium-cooled fast reactor, or an SFR. So it runs at 345 megawatts base load, but it can operate up to 500 megawatts. because the way that this technology is created, the way that it's designed, it allows molten salt to store energy during the fission phase and the heat generation phase. And when there are times of peak system need, very much like when we run our gas units, this unit can take that heat that's being stored in that molten salt and can boost the output of the unit. So these units operate both as baseload and peaking assets. There is a demonstration plant that's under construction in Kemmerer, Wyoming. In fact, somebody that's on my team is making a trip out there to work with TerraPower. We have an annual meeting with them next week with a number of other utilities in the country. They're going to go visit that demonstration site in Kemmerer and take a look at it. This project, this technology is supported by the U.S. Department of Energy's Advanced Reactor Development or Demonstration Program, the ARDP. And the last company that I want to talk about, and the one that I'm most excited about, is X-Energy. X-Energy was formed just a few years ago, and the folks that formed this are former U.S. nuclear Navy staff. And this technology is very different than anything else that you'll see in the industry. Instead of a large reactor, this unit uses these little balls, and they're about the size of a pool ball. There's 220,000 of these. They're called TRISO fuel particles. Each of them is one kernel of uranium that's wrapped in thousands and thousands of layers of carbon. Each individual fuel ball there is its own containment vessel for storage. And so in the worst of events, and there was an explosion or an accident, and these fuel balls went all over the place, each of them is a self-contained storage vessel that's insulating 99.99% of the radiation that's coming from this unit. The way that they structure this, and the easiest way to imagine it, is a paper towel tube filled with a bunch of BBs. And what that is each of those is generating heat, and it's circulating helium through that tube that's heating gas, heating water, turning turbine, creating energy. It's a really exciting technology that's producing energy, that's also insulating the fuel, and that's providing storage as well. 80 megawatts per reactor module. We can scale them, and there's a demonstration plant in development today with Dow and the USCC Seadrift operation in the Texas Gulf Coast. Again, this is another technology that's being supported by the US ARDP program. Number of hurdles in the way of nuclear energy today. Regulatory hurdle is one. Very hard to permit them. A lot of states think nuclear, right? You think 3 Mile Island, they think Chernobyl. These are events that are extraordinarily unlikely. This technology is very safe today. Nuclear technology is very safe. It does have high initial capital costs. Public perception is another issue. Just because of the perception of nuclear, there is a level of engagement with the public that would be needed if you wanted to build a plant like this. And then finally, market competition. They are expensive. I talked about the capital costs. When you're talking about this versus gas, gas does have an advantage. But long term, gas includes higher operating costs, fuel costs, maintenance costs, things that these nuclear technologies don't have. So upfront capital, it's more expensive. Long run operating, it's cheaper. There is a large opportunity for nuclear in this country, though. We have a growing energy demand, decarbonization goals that can be filled primarily by clean, firm baseload power. We have supportive policies and funding. This administration that's in the White House right now has a very large focus on nuclear. There was an executive order that was issued about 2.5 weeks ago that creates the incentives, that creates the directives to increase the nuclear fleet in the U.S. by orders of magnitude over the next 10 to 20 years. So this technology is attracting an enormous amount of interest from this administration in our country right now. In fact, in the House bill that passed, it's the only technology that retains tax credit benefits that are sunsetting for wind and storage and solar. Nuclear retains those. So in summary of everything that I spoke about, reliability is a top priority for GRE, for MISO, for our members, for the market. We do see some risks as the fleet evolves, but we also see opportunities for these new technologies like small modular reactors. There are new capacity rules, requirements underway that incentivize the correct market behavior and the provision of reliability assets to the system. And the priorities that we have for future capacity investments or availability, we want to make sure that these units are there when we need them. and that they can run, they have fuel supply, they have availability, the coldest of days, the hottest of days. They're flexible. They're flexible both in the way they can operate, the way their fuel is available, and then finally affordability, right? There is an upper limit to what we can spend, and there's prudent investments that we have to make. And so when we're creating our portfolio, when MISO is looking at the grid, when the administration, when the states are creating policies that incentivize different behaviors, we want to make sure that affordability, reliability, and the sustainability of our environment remain top priorities. So bringing it all back to the carbon-free standard, GRE is in a really good position. By 2030, we'll be 90% decarbonized from where we were in 2005, minimizing our members' risk to future policy-making decisions both in the state and at the federal level. We've also done that by keeping our costs 20% below the weighted regional average rates in this part of the country. So we acted early, and we took the initiative to do what our members were giving us the directive to do, which is to create a portfolio that balances affordability, reliability, and cleanliness. I think that's my last slide. I'll take questions with the panel later. Thank you.